The big question of this segment is, how do paleontologists study the history of life? Paleontology is essentially time travel. Paleontologists study the history of life on Earth, which takes us on an unbelievably interesting journey. This discipline sits at the intersection of a number of scientific areas. Biology, of course, we're dealing with the remains of once living animals. Geology, because of course these animals or plants are entombed within rocks, so we need to know about the way that rocks form. And of course the decay mechanisms associated with the death and post-mortem activities are chemical. So from that point of view, paleontology is unique. We can subdivide paleontology into three major disciplines. I guess the first would be paleobiology, which is really evolutionary in nature. Here we're trying to reconstruct animals as they once were, looking at the skeletons and sometimes the soft parts when they're preserved to try and reconstruct those animals as once living forms. And of course, because we've got this record through time, we can chart the progress of evolution. One of the other subdisciplines, of course, is paleoenvironmental reconstruction or paleoecology, understanding organisms as groups. They, of course, don't live in a vacuum. They live and interact with each other on a daily basis. And we need to understand in detail the environments in which they live, whether it be at the deepest part of the sea, up on the continental shelf, or out on the terrestrial savannas. And we can do that by studying the fossils, but also the host sediments and rocks that they're preserved in. The other important aspects of paleontology, which you've come across already, is stratigraphy. Because we're going back through time and looking at a record through time, we can start to correlate or age. We can provide an age to various important milestone events in the history of life on Earth. Fossils, whether they be body or trace fossils, are really the only direct evidence that we have to access life forms in the deep past. Think about it. If we didn't have the rock record and we only had the diversity of organisms that were with us today, we would have no idea that dinosaurs, for instance, existed at some point in the past. And this leads on to an extremely important key fact. 99% of the species that have ever evolved on this planet are now extinct. So the living taxa today represent only the tips, the leaves of a much older tree of life. Deciphering the ancestry of animals requires detective work, moving gradually and steadily along those deep branches that precede the leaves that we recognise today as part of the living biosphere. The fossil record is also really important because it provides an independent yardstick to test the accuracy of molecular clocks, which of course are based on estimates by comparing genetic distance between living taxa. And the fossil record can act as judge, if not jury, on the lineage splits between species that are purported to have occurred in the past. So my research is mostly focused on a milestone event in the evolution of life, the Cambrian radiation. This particular event is essentially when complex animals really radiated to form the great variety of organisms that we see in the modern day, especially those animals with a bilaterally symmetrical body plan. The radiation itself also saw, apart from that, the emergence of skeletons for the first time, hard parts produced by a multitudinous number of animals almost synchronously in the fossil record. Those organisms also evolved key features including limbs, eyes, and teeth for active predation. So this is where we see the increase in ecological complexity that we recognise in most modern, especially marine environments. We also see the first reefs develop, built by complex animals and, for the first time, organisms that burrow into the substrate. And because of that, we can look then at the base of the animal tree of life by looking at the fossils that are preserved 540 million years ago to see what sorts of animals were there and how different they were from subsequent antecedents. Of course, to access this particular point in time, we have to go to rocks of the right age. Paleontology, of course, involves a great amount of field work, which is really the best bit of the discipline. It allows us to travel to some of the most spectacular and exotic places around the world. We have to know a lot about the geology, and we go to those places where the geology of Cambrian age is particularly well exposed. Luckily, in Australia, the Flinders Ranges is the hub of research if you're interested in the Cambrian explosion. I've also been to a number of other exotic places, including Morocco and the Transantarctic Mountains, to sample rocks of the same age, to see if we've got any correlation. Do we have the same organisms occurring at the same time? Many of the fossils that we see in the field, you can see with the naked eye. Many of them, of course, are microscopic. So the vast majority of them are placed into very weak acids, acetic acid or formic acid, and these dissolve the limestone very slowly and very gently, and in so doing reveal the tiny microfossils which are not affected by the acid whatsoever. We can then bring them up to the laboratory and examine them under the microscope and pick out the microfossils that are going to tell us the most about the questions we're trying to solve. The picked material of these microfossils is really, really interesting. What we find are tiny little shells which collectively are just called small shelly fossils. Exactly what you see. But they're really important for answering questions about early animal evolution because these shells represent some of the earliest skeletons in the fossil record, and therefore a substantial proportion of the diversity of the first complex organisms. However, most of these shells are part of a very complex skeleton. What we tend to get are isolated fragments that are actually derived from a much more complex chainmail-like armour of a complex skeleton. The challenge is to put these sclerites back together in the same multi-component skeleton. To put the jigsaw puzzle together, we utilise a range of fantastic imaging technology. Our core piece of equipment is the scanning electron microscope, which allows us to look at high magnification, tiny elements of the microstructure and the microornament, and allows us to accurately identify each of these jigsaw shelly pieces. We also use frontier imaging technology such as X-ray computer tomography, what you probably know as CT scanning, to really have a close look and produce three-dimensional images of these microfossils, which are otherwise really difficult to manipulate just under the microscope. So this new 3D technology provides us for the first time a chance to put this jigsaw puzzle, this animal jigsaw puzzle, back together in such a way that we can really test ideas about the origins of animals and the skeletons that they produce. The techniques that we've been using now show us that small shelly fossils are no longer as enigmatic as they once were. Many can be recognised as ancestral members of phyla that we recognise today: arthropods, mollusks, brachiopods. We've gone a long way to untangling the early roots of animal evolution during the Cambrian explosion, but the full story has yet to emerge.